Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, July 22nd, 2020. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very pleased to kick off a new series of our weekly Broadband Breakfast Live Online event. This is Champions of Broadband. And for the next month and a half, or perhaps a little more, we will be focusing with one-on-one interviews with thoughtful leaders and thinkers, people who have devoted their careers to better broadband, better lives in whatever capacity, right? It could be engineering, it could be law, it could be policy, it could be government service, it could be on the front lines as ISP providers, or other ways, right? And we're actually going to start off with a very thoughtful and thought-provoking critic of a lot of maybe conventional wisdom when it comes to broadband and internet service. But we'll get to him in just one moment. I want to make sure that each of you know that we're going to be here every Wednesday, 12 noon. We've been doing this for 4 months now. We started Broadband and the Coronavirus on March 13th as a way to bring the broadband community together to talk about how broadband, high-speed internet services can help be solutions to the disconnectedness in this crazy time. And we've continued on a weekly basis in April, May, June, now into July, and we're gonna keep going. I also want to let everyone know that in less than 3 weeks, we, Broadband Breakfast, will be hosting Digital Infrastructure Investment, which will be a special virtual summit that is part of the Broadband Community Summit. Now, we were originally going to be together with them physically, but since everyone's gone virtual, it will be a virtual event, and then it will be replayed when the Broadband Communities Summit happens in September. But we'll be here on August 10th, Monday, from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So I hope you'll just have that on your calendar. You can register. Just go to broadbandbreakfast.com and you'll be able to register for that. Now, let me go ahead and introduce our guest for today. It is Bob Frankston. Bob is no stranger to many of you in broadband community. I think I first met Bob at the David Eisenberg's event that he had for many years, and Bob is, like I said at the top, is very thought-provoking. He has been thinking about these issues for more than half a century. He has degrees in computer science, electrical engineering, and mathematics from MIT. He's a fellow of the Computer History Museum, the IEEE, and the Association of Computing Machinery, ACM, and has received numerous awards for his work. And he's currently focused on the very issue we're passionate about, enabling a connected world with broadband as infrastructure. So Bob has laid out some of these ideas, by no means all, in 2 expert opinion pieces on Broadband Breakfast. That's why I kind of was thinking of Bob when we wanted to kick off the series. Very grateful he's joined us. Bob, let me go ahead and turn it over to you for a little bit. Tell us just a little bit about your background, particularly the Visicalc experience, which I know was quite important and significant in some of your thinking about computing, communications, and our connected world. So over to you, and thanks for being with us today, Bob.
Okay, thank you very much. I like to think of myself as a positive advocate rather than a critic, because there are all these exciting ideas we can build on. But I want to go back to, as we were talking before, I've been in the world of consumer electronics since my childhood. And got online in '66, and you mentioned my master's thesis, and I was studying operating system technology, but I realized humans don't care about CPU cycles. You got to speak to them in a language they understand. So and that's always been my focus. How do you make the technology usable by people? But the challenge I've had is bridging the underlying technology to what people, see. And one of the challenges I have is, there's a new paradigm here. That this is not just networking, but so, there's a lot of my background, I should just go over briefly, that influences this, because I had the fortunate opportunity to watch as these technologies developed from first principles. Like when time sharing, so Unix born, and so the underbelly of the financial world.
Let's talk specifically about Visicalc. There may be some in our audience who don't know what Visicalc is. So
okay, let's get that. You're right. Keep me moving along because I can easily get diverted. And okay, so Visicalc was the first electronic spreadsheet. It was actually developed by Dan Bricklin, and all that background went into it. By the way, Excel is the current, leader of that. But Dan and I had both been, working in the industry for many years at that point, but we still were kids, of course. And the Apple II basically was affordable by everybody. But the challenge was, how do you take advantage of this to give people the chance to work with numbers, need numbers, and a K-NE-ID like you need dough. And that was a very different way of thinking than traditionally, you run a program, it takes a while. And the goal was not to do calculations, people like a mortgage calculator, but to give them the power of the computer or tool. And the thing I never forgot when writing Visicalc was I had to take this Apple II, which people thought of as a toy, and make it disappear so people could focus on their tasks. And it was that example of sort of taming technology. Visicalc is a program I wrote to implement it, but Visicalc was the experience. And that's the theme here again, bridging from this, translating the underlying technology to the full possibilities. And often without knowing that process in the middle, what I say sometimes doesn't make sense. And the challenge for me is, how do I bridge that?
So Visicalc, I guess at some point it became Excel, got acquired by Microsoft, and you started working with Microsoft, and you've done a fair bit of networking, whether for Microsoft or just kind of tinkering to make things work. Talk a little bit about some of those, and you wrote about these in your pieces for Broadband Breakfast and elsewhere.
So my first experience with computer networking was 1966. When we had to build our own networks. We'd run wires on the floor. Then I took a terminal home at that point and been working from home ever since. And we built our own networks. So the ARPANET didn't start all this. That was just one network. But one of the key experiences I had was in spring of 1973 when we studied radio packet networks. And we called them networks, but it was later when we realized it's not a network at all. It's just a facility we used and we programmed around it. There was no provider as such. And you had to innovate in software. And that was sort of the first inkling of how you can program around systems and software. And there were two main things that came out of the class. And as I said, I've been lucky to be at the nexus of change many times. First, there was a kid next to me in class, Bob Metcalf, who put that on a coaxial cable. He called it Ethernet. But that idea was also what enabled the Internet Networking Project to happen. And, looking back, the Internet is not a network in the traditional sense. It finessed all the normal networking. But because when you look at through the lens of networking to act like a network, that's what makes it so hard for people to think of how fundamentally different it is in traditional networks. But that experience, so the other transformative experience was home networking. So in 1995, if you got a second PC or a device, you'd have to have another account for each device. Do you remember the days when you used to have, each time you got a phone line in the house, you had to have the number, you paid per set-top box and all of this? That was the world in which personal computing was supposed to fit. You got two computers, you got two accounts. You got two IP light bulbs, which nobody thought of then, two accounts. It wouldn't have scaled. But because I was working at home in this room, you could say it's a lab. I basically experimented with, how do I take that one connection from Media One and share it with all the devices in my house? And I happened to work in Microsoft. I was commuting. It was a 3,000-mile commute, but better than being on the expressway. So I wanted to interconnect my house with Microsoft's offices, but also the world. And I took that idea, and basically that became today's home network. Because as Microsoft, I built it into Windows. So you bring a PC to the house, you just connect. You don't get another account. You don't ask Comcast or whomever for permission. Imagine if I hadn't done that, and every time you got a PC, you had to carefully get a new account for each one. It wouldn't have scaled. But people, it happens so early, people think it's by magic. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to be. So when they leave the house, they still buy an account per phone account. This watch needs a separate account. Each device needs a separate account. So what I'm doing is taking that proven idea, which is essentially 100% of the homes, and simply saying we've got to take it to the next level.
So okay, how did it physically work? I mean, did you dialed up a line? You had a modem?
Okay, in the good old days.
The good old days.
The short version, because it's actually part of the problem we have. A lot of stories overlap and they become confused. Okay. So one story is if you're in a university, you just plugged into the network and you were connected. That was it. There's a separate world of dialing directly up to dial-up time sharing. When you bring a modem home and you dialed in. And those two were really different worlds. And what started to happen, and there's also another trend happening then. If you remember, you used to have a separate long distance company from your local company.
Right.
And you had to sign up for a carrier. So all these came together because the telephone company said, okay, the internet is another long distance phone company. This is the days of early DSL. You signed up for your long distance carrier, you signed up for your internet company, and they would take you to the internet to someplace far away. The other trend was the bulletin board systems, where you dial up into bulletin board systems, and then they started connecting to the rest of the world on the back end. So all those are ways of bridging into the university network. If you go to university, you had none of that. You just plugged in and it worked. And that's what enabled Tim Berners-Lee to say, I'm going to make this web available to everybody, because he didn't have to negotiate. There's no dial-up. So these trends became intertwined and confused. And one interesting part of it was in the 1990s, modems were clogging up the phone network. You dialed up, you stayed online. And suddenly, one day, the crisis disappeared. What happened was we started to switch to native packets. So the point about the modem story is that it's actually diversion. The model I have in my mind is you just plug in and it works. So when it was at home, so the home networking worked on a different principle. My attitude was I should just be on my machine. It should just be connected all the time. And that was basically the genesis of home networking. You stayed connected. You didn't just dial up. It was always there. And it happened along with so-called broadband. And that's a story in itself, because the word broadband basically prevents communications, because we use the word as if we understand what it is, without a shared meaning. And go the whole history of the word going from radio and television. Matter of fact, you know when the first broadband design I know of was? May 1973. After Bob did his baseband Ethernet, I wanted to put on the campus network. So I wanted to do a broadband version. I didn't deploy it. But the word so the real word broadband came into common use when the carriers, the cable companies, the carriers saw a chance to make a lot of money. Because if you had a broadband which sounds like fat pipe, so we don't have to go to the original meaning, you could sell somebody another phone number without any equipment. You just type the number in, they sold it, you charge them as if there was a phone line, and basically, there was no cost to it. And that's really the opportunity I seized with home networking. I said, well, why let them sell you the line when you could take control of it?
Right. So one slight diversion that I think is relevant, because you mentioned this again in your pieces that are linked on this page, is Minitel, right? And you had a kind of an interesting take on Minitel. Most people regard it as, oh, this is what kept the French from getting the internet. But tell me your reaction to Minitel and what it means for now.
Okay, well, that is true. It kept them off the internet. But Minitel at the beginning was exciting. It was a time-sharing service, basically, offered by the phone company. And everybody in France got a terminal. And that was really way ahead of its time. And it was justified financially. It was cheaper than sending out phone books. You had all these new services. The problem was it was locked into the telephone paradigm, which meant you'd be charged per minute based on the number. Do you remember 900 numbers?
Yeah.
That was the U.S. version of the telematique. Now, one byproduct of this was, at that point, another development was Bell Labs was doing Unix, which was a spin-off of the Multics project I was on. So people were worried about AT&T exploiting its advantage to get into the information services world. So they invented Title I, Title II, some sort of hand-waving to try to limit what you could do, who could own Unix, who can get in the telematics world. It was all very confusing because people really didn't understand the market then. There was divestiture, where they decided it was a wholesale retail model. They did the wrong split, and that's why it failed. So all of that comes together where, yes, there was an idea of the information services, but they still viewed it through the old lens, which hobbled it.
So we've been talking about this old model, old lens. Let's bring this into the future, right, or at least the present. And I actually want to highlight a quick anecdote from David Eisenberg's Freedom to Connect conference. I'm not sure if this is the one we met at or first talking, but this was actually by Harold Feld, who was one of our guests last week on another topic. He said something to the effect that what's changed, this was in 2009, 2010, what's changed about broadband, and he used that word, is that it's no longer about what the companies are doing, it's about what the users are doing too. And by the way, Bob, I mean, obviously I appreciate you're not a critic, but there are certainly critics of your philosophy, right? And we hear from them occasionally. And so I want to just ask this question about, let's get to the heart of this issue of what is properly should be seen as infrastructure and what should properly be seen as services. Because we talk a lot about this. We've done a lot of reporting on open access, on wholesale networks. We're going to do more on these. And I'd like to get your take, just going way back to the point of what is the right way to think about the services versus the infrastructure.
Okay. So I often use the analogy of railroads versus roads or sidewalks. So railroads was a business in which you would sell rides. That was the business, and the facilities are owned by the railroad as a cost of doing business. Roads are fundamentally different. They're just streets, or asphalt, or paths. You use them to create your own solutions. You don't depend on it. If there's no road, take a boat, swim, fly. There was no rules. It wasn't a one-to-one mapping. And this is where voice over IP comes in. It's not a phone service. It was actually meant to be an anti-phone service. So we're trying to fit roads into a railroad model. We're treating lanes as tracks, and you change lanes, it's a switch track. It doesn't make sense. We're going through all these contortions. But let me back off a bit to this term best efforts.
Okay.
Because I mentioned that class, first seeing these basic ideas. And the key thing is we use software in our devices to basically program around the system. So the packet radios, if you lost a packet, you resent it. But what we didn't realize then was maybe you don't resend it. If you want the latest temperature, get the latest temperature. If you're doing streaming, use the computing power in a very different way. You don't use it to resend because that's a delay. In the old days, if you got a dropout on a call, you hear a big click. These days, you don't, because the computer software fills it in, guesses, programs around it, might be buffering. There are lots of different algorithms. So we don't need somebody to basically guarantee a path for the call, because in the old days, we can prove scientifically that telephony needed a reserved path, which your ear was sensitive, until VoIP IP was discovered completely outside the telephone system. And what this means is that we need a fundamentally different approach. So the reason I compare it with the railroad is if you're selling telephony as a service, and I don't know how many people know about the Hushaphone decision, where the phone company argued that the telephone itself was part of their service, was not something you owned.
Sorry, could you just repeat the decision that you're talking about?
Phone.
Sorry, one more time.
Hushaphone.
Hushaphone, right. So Hushaphone was preceded the Carter phone, correct?
Yes, by about 20 years.
Okay. So remind us what the Hushaphone is.
Okay, Hushaphone was basically just a box. You put it on top of your telephone, and it would mute the call, so everybody in the room wouldn't be hearing your conversation. AT&T sued them, saying Hushaphone was illegal because it reduced the quality of service and harmed AT&T. Okay, that's the mindset we still have now. Now, you mentioned Carter phone. You weren't allowed to do your answering machine. Now, some of us were hooking devices up anyway. We ignored that. We hooked devices up anyway. We're violating the law. But Carter phone exposed a major problem with the phone network. They did too good a job of engineering. Because once you had your red-green wire, You couldn't destroy the network. They claimed that it was dangerous. There was no harm you can do. And it was a simple interface so anybody could connect to it. Now they hide all this complexity, cellular and everything. But if you go back to the red green wire, what I learned in class, the underlying technology is very simple. It's packets are very simple and everything. The big breakthrough is understanding what we call the end-to-end principle, which is behind the internet, which is the meaning is only at the endpoints. And this is the way speech works. If I'm talking to you in Chinese, somebody listening in the middle doesn't know what it is. But also, they can't relay the message because this is the whole problem with the phone network. They try to preserve the exact signal because they didn't know what was important. So if we separate meaning now, or the applications from the network, we have to think very differently. So this is the road model. The railroad's not going to sell me a ride up Mount Everest. But if I have the facilities, I can do it myself. And the same way, all I need now are facilities that enable me to connect. So your home network, you put it's hard to do a short version of it, so it gets very confusing. But the idea is the key point is, I think the simple way now, it becomes easier. If you think of cable TV, I just read an article of Variety today. People confused the cable. You needed a cable for cable TV. Suddenly it's over the top. It doesn't matter what the cable is. We've completely decoupled it. In fact, I've got a Comcast Flex box. It runs over my Fios connection. I get all the Comcast services rules, but over Fios.
Right. No, exactly. And this is the transformation, the digital transformation. Broadband is right. So I just want to kind of be clear on, you're introducing the point of best efforts as a way to sort of maybe show the flexibility, right? The adage of the internet, it treats censorship as a network block.
It's deeper than that. First, it's a term of art. We have to be very careful. People think what they know. Best efforts means we're not asking anything. Just try to send a packet. Don't do me favors. And don't be perverse and block it. That's all I'm asking. Yeah. So that is sort of the key idea, that I don't need all these services. What it means, the key idea means, is I don't need a provider. A provider is like a railroad. They reserve a path from one end to another. This means we can own the facilities locally. We don't need to have, in other words, we can own, like you own your home network, your city can own its own facilities.
Right.
When the city puts in fiber, it doesn't need to bring an ISP, and whose only purpose is to prevent you from communicating. But one more point I just want to on this. The big change is, it used to be, okay, broadband is something you buy, 80% of the people can get it, you can't afford it, okay. Today, in order to do education, in order to do healthcare, 100% of the people need it. So we need a policy that assumes everybody has it, in which case, why are we billing people individually? Why are we preventing free riders when we no longer have free riders? We need to take a different.
Well, very good point, and we want to kind of continue on that. So, okay, we got the best efforts concept. We've got the infrastructure versus services, and that I didn't want to zoom through that so quickly, but let me go ahead and mention the point you've just brought out, which is who should own the infrastructure. So let's talk infrastructure versus services, and who should own infrastructure.
Okay, important point. So we understand that the services are separate, and the legacy we have of subscribing goes back to the service areas. If you're buying a phone call, you don't apply that. You don't have a turnstile at your house. So the hard part is to understand what the word own means. Before we can say who owns it, we have to understand what own means. When a railroad or a phone company owns their facilities, they're the exclusive owner. If you add another access point, you're bypassing them, you're stealing their service. If a city owns the streets and you let people walk across the path, assuming you have no lawyers, but put that aside, and you provide a path between two streets that can walk past your house and let them, you're adding to the capacity. You're helping the city. So this is not exclusive ownership in the old sense. Right now, we have a telecom system that's government controlled. Every little aspect is regulated. Once it becomes a facility locally owned where anybody can contribute, it's not exclusive owner, all they're doing is carrying packets, they're not carrying services, then we have a very different model. It's locally owned, but in the sense of as a community, not exclusionary. It's more of somebody being a steward and taking responsibility to help out.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so I mean, are you basically saying that obviously municipalities should be able, in your view, to build networks. Should it be more than that? I mean, should there be? I mean, like how extreme do we get? How do we get to the world we're just talking about and envisioning, and the current world where we have lots of private providers, whether national or small scale providers?
So let me answer that in a couple of ways. So let's talk about a greenfield where city puts new fiber.
Okay.
The approach is DDT, which is don't do that. Don't bring an ISP in for no reason other than to prevent people from using it in order to build them individually. Which, as we said, if 100% of the people have it, why are we going through all this mechanism just to, they were not nice words, just to be not nice. Let's put it that way.
Right.
Okay. So now let's look at an existing city. Now we have a legacy of.
No, sorry, before we get to the existing city, let me just be clear again. So again, we kind of alighted a little bit over the what's infrastructure, what's services. Are you suggesting the city needs to simply do the infrastructure, right? Yeah. Not do the services, because
all they do is help packets mosey along. Just like they put streets and sidewalks to help you get along. They don't guarantee you're going to get to your destination. They just provide an opportunity, and even sidewalks are an optimization. If you had a dirt path, that works fine as long as you had hip boots. Then you put in sidewalks, to improve it, but they're not fundamental. It's a very different way of thinking.
So are you basically talking dark fiber? The city lays dark fiber, and
it's city. It doesn't matter. No, it's not. Okay, very careful. You light it up to IP. To the packet, because you don't need dark fiber. The problem with dark fiber is it's like giving everybody their own lane. No, you have common streets. You share it by normalizing it to internet packets, but you don't necessarily need fiber. You can mix radios, you can mix fiber. It's amazing how much capacity we have on the existing copper. 25 years ago, I proposed taking the existing copper just by changing the line cards. We could have had 100% broadband at say 10 megabits 25 years ago, at the speed when the house was running at that speed. Now, of course, it would have been many gigabits. So it's really, that's what I'm talking about, thinking differently. It's not the physical means, it's an economic problem. We can buy the infrastructure. Also, fiber is very cheap. The only reason it's expensive is because we have a cost plus telecom companies boondoggle. Basically, if we did any mix and match, we'd use much better technologies. We invest. Verizon is, for example, is using the least cost approach of Fios, because they think they're not going to be in that business for long. What you can do is invest for the long term with better technology, better equipment, with a higher capital cost. But since you own it and you're amortizing the expenses, you become an owner. You're not paying forever. You don't so you can make much smarter investments. You can make, and there are new radio technologies behind 5G. Forget the stupid network stuff. Is an interesting radio, but as Wi-Fi 6, it also increased capacity. The one point is by normalizing the packets, we can mix and match all of this. You have fiber here, you can be opportunistic, you can do what you want.
Mm-hmm. So a model that we've written a lot about on Broadband Breakfast, and I've talked a lot about, is when you have a open access or wholesale model where there's one entity that has a quote ownership or some kind of infrastructure role in the network, another that's operating the network but not offering services, and the third doing the services. Now, we talked a little bit about the services. The services are clearly, people individually with companies billing. That's what you charge for. The infrastructure piece is the piece that is kind of needs to be like sidewalks, needs to be universal. So let's just hone in on who's operating. I mean, who's lighting up the network and facilitating the connection.
Okay, who's lighting up your home network? You buy the gear, you do it yourself. In this case of the city, who operates traffic lights and stuff, you can hire people, you can own it, you can have any mix. So in other words, that's just a job function. To be the sewer commissioner, you don't have to be an expert on sewers. You hire people who know sewers. Larger cities will get a staff that knows it. Smaller cities will hire people. There are plenty of people with the capability. Now, the one danger is a lot of people, the expertise, think in terms of the old telephone approach, but they can still operate a network. So that's very easy. And the other point, when I was doing home networking, people basically thought I was crazy. They still think I'm crazy, but that's a separate discussion. When they said people can operate themselves, we're not going to have installers. They were just going to go to the retail store, buy it, and put it in. And I just removed anything and made it hard. There's nothing really that hard about networking. We make it hard because we're trying to fit it into a telecom framing, which is all based on scarcity and stuff. But if you think, first principles, it's very easy to get the packets to move. And the big breakthrough was TCP, which basically said we can handle congestion all that outside the network. The problem is when you get an old operator who does buffering and does favors aligned to TCP, and that's where we got buffer bloat, then you break it. So we actually, by making it simple, we make it better.
Okay, so speaking specifically now on this ownership question, and we'll get to how we get to the non-greenfield, but in the greenfield, the don't do that world where the city you're suggesting should have an ownership role and presumably a light up the fiber network role, and then the question is, well, what options does one have? I mean, what if I want to offer a network? For whatever reason, I'm not satisfied. Let's just talk a little bit about the competitive model.
So this is, let's say you're not satisfied with the electricity service. What do? Do you run your own wire? Well, some people buy a generator and stuff. You can buy a big radio, but that's been a relatively non-issue once you have enough capacity. I mean, there are certain things that take community. You don't like the sidewalk? Well, you run your own sidewalk. The difference here, if you can get a big radio and stuff, you might be able to bypass, but that's really necessary. So it's hard to see any case where it would make sense for people to basically build their own competing network. Now, I'll give you one case, though. If you're basically stealing pennies from widows and orphans, called high-speed trading, you might want a dedicated fiber. But short of that, does Netflix run its own fiber or anything? No. Makes much more sense to take part in this vast commons, because basically people don't appreciate how much capacity there is. In a city with 2 broadbands, you got 2x the capacity right out of the bat, and you're not even using a smidgen.
Mm-hmm. What are some cities or communities that are doing this well, that are models for us?
I mean, that's a challenge now, because there's Altamundi in Argentina where the community owns the facilities. But for the most part, even the tragedy is a city that puts in the fiber, then brings an ISP to prevent them from using it. So yes, but there are real examples. Universities, it's open everywhere. Businesses, you go to your desk and you have to pay to plug in your computer. No. So it's a norm wherever you have a responsible owner, like a business or a campus. The challenge is to basically get people to understand that they don't have to accept the old model. I remember a friend, Tim Pozard, talking about connecting the Farallon Islands. Mm-hmm. And he said it cost $10,000. And there was a deafening sound of him not saying per month. You just ready for per month. There's no per month. There's a one-time charge. So there are cases like that where people do it for themselves, maybe on a farm, in the facilities. But this is the challenge, is to get people to see past, same old.
Okay, so we got a question here. I'll go ahead and put it up here for you, Bob. This is from Mike Wendy. Wilson, North Carolina offers it all. It competes with other providers for customers.
But it's one shift short of the new paradigm, because it's still what is it competing for? It's like competing sidewalks. It's a facility. It's not a service, and that's the change in paradigm. And innovation will proceed much, much, much faster. Telcos have 40-year cycles. They still have not finished the dial phone to touchtone conversion after half a century. Okay, you get innovation when you structure a market. The reason so by separating the transport from what we do with it, we get the web and all that innovation. You don't need to build a new infrastructure each time. Where you stop innovation is you get Verizon say, we're in the fiber business, or we're in the one business. They really have to stick to that for a long time. But normalizing the packet, and I wrote about this in an essay, Beyond Computing, that Moore's law operates when you decouple 2 markets. So by separating the service from the infrastructure, we enable innovation. Now, she mentioned 5G. There are 2 parts to 5G. One is the radios, which could be Wi-Fi 6. But the more important 5G is to kill the internet, because the economic model of the internet basically prevents the value from going to telcos, which is why I view this as an economic problem. We need an economic model which does not depend on the value going to the network. If you buy Netflix View, the value goes to Netflix. It doesn't go to the cable company. So how do they provide more cable. So we need an economic model which enables that.
All right. So two questions about infrastructure and services, and then I want to get to how we do the brownfields. So one question is about where is that line divided, right? So what does it mean to say separate transport and services, and where is kind of, you know, at the margins between the two? And the second point is really one about well, let's just take that one first. Okay, what is the dividing line between services and transport, and let's just reiterate again why it's important and vital in your view to separate them.
Okay, let's look at the home network. When you use Wi-Fi or Ethernet, they're just packets. You don't know that this packet is part of a phone call, it's part of a Netflix stream. It's just a raw packet out there, especially when it's encrypted. So that's raw packet.
Sorry, I don't understand.
And then Google comes. Do not name your kid that name I shall not say. Okay, so it's that. It's like in a computer. You have compute cycles. You don't have, it's not English or whatever. It's just, meaningless numbers. So these are just packets. So simply providing a packet and saying, if you pass me the packet, I'll pass it on to the next guy. That's the transport, and that's it. The web, even all the other stuff is not fundamental in that sense. So it becomes actually, that's what makes it simple, because you're just dealing with packets. You don't worry about if it's a phone call. You don't worry about whether it's a video stream. It's just packets, and that's why, if you have a legacy phone service, you pay for the phone call, but Zoom is free. Mm-hmm. That's a little strange, and it also is a reminder of the power of separating models, because when the phone company did do video, it failed because it had to charge for it as a service and was too expensive.
Right. So that's the second piece I want to get at, which is to say, does the separation of transport and services inevitably devalue transport? And if you say yes, is that the point, right? Or no?
Devalue, I wouldn't use the word devalue. It says we need to pay for the transport without trying to tax the services. So the analogy I use is the electric grid. People think of broadband like the electric grid. The problem with that analogy is electricity has an intrinsic value and needs the wire as a path. So we pay for the grid by taxing the intrinsic value, the cost of generating the electricity. You can look at, a coulomb or whatever electricity and say it costs that much to generate. And that's the economic model. The problem is, you look at a packet on the wire, there's no intrinsic value. The packet is not even necessary. You might lose a few, you might cache it. So that whole model doesn't work. So we have to find a way of financing the infrastructure, which is valuable, but not valuable in a way of how much can we take the services, but is valuable in the same way streets and sidewalks are valuable.
All right. So that seems to suggest, okay, this is a public good. This is the type of thing that should be done through collective action, through financing. And you've laid out your view on greenfields. How do we get to this world that you're positing is better for the rest of the world that already has ISPs that are going to say, wait, time out, I don't like this approach that.
Okay. Okay. A lot of it's education. Google keeps popping up there.
According to Wikipedia,
I'm going to shut the speaker off so it's not bothering us. This is the problem. We have people doing you favors.
Yeah.
So if I told you that you could pay $100 a month for gigabit service, or you can pay $0 a month, which would you choose?
Well, it depends on how much the services are going to cost.
No, but the services you're paying for anyway, separately. You're still paying Netflix in both cases.
Okay. Well, then, of course, I'll take the $0.
Right. And my argument is, so where I am, we're paying for 3 broadband connections. Okay. First, which guarantees us triple the price. All of them are profitable. So right off the bat, we got triple the cost. But now we look at it is, let's say it costs $1,000 per house to drop the wire, to drop a fiber. Okay. I'm paying $100 a month for that fiber. In a year, I've paid it off. Okay. So if you look at the economics, once people understand it, it's compelling. And also the reason why we have a broadband crisis is that it doesn't make sense to invest in money if you're not going to get any of the value people get from using it. So at some point, it's more of a matter of understanding than anything. And then what we do in the cities, so if once we have a few examples, there's greenfield cities that are nirvanas, then I think it'll be easier to explain to cities that if they basically, so one intermediate approach. Let's say we've got Verizon providing retail service to everybody. If the city then negotiates with Verizon and says, look, we're going to have a whole contract. We're going to be your customer. You're going to maintain it for us and everything. That's first a lot cheaper for the people involved in everything. But then what do the other two providers do? So we've got an economic model. Once you understand it, is our current system is not sustainable. It's sort of, what do you do about all the stables in a city and all the horse-drawn trolleys?
Just repeat what you said. I think it's a very interesting idea that I haven't heard discussed that much. You're basically saying the city come in and say, we'll be your customer. We want to buy this. Again, come back to the law and the policy. How do you forbid, or are you trying to forbid others?
No, you don't.
You're not.
As a matter of fact, you go to Comcast, which is really NBC. Okay, remember Comcast knows this is happening. They're ready to abandon all the wires. They are NBC Universal. That's why the Flexbox works over Fios. Peacock, they want to sell to everybody. And they have more to gain by not having to sustain the infrastructure than they have to lose, because their future is NBC. So, but if, let's say, they wanted to compete with their infrastructure, fine. But would that be a sane thing to do? The tragedy of Google Fiber is they didn't take the infrastructure approach and deal with the city. They tried to become another cable company. In that case, Comcast says, okay, we can do our infrastructure too. You're protecting us by setting a price floor because you have another infrastructure. You're trying to finance retail.
All right. So you're saying one way to kind of move to this world where infrastructure is separate and publicly financed and operated is to have the city be the customer, right? And have a private company come in, or presumably, the entity itself could do it, or community by community. I mean, for example, there are communities where there's an ownership, right? Like a homeowners association or a group of neighbors gets together and puts a company together that owns that asset, right? That's then operated.
Exactly. What I say, it's local ownership at scale. You own your home network. If you're in a homeowner association, apartment house, it would own the facilities there. And you get the other way, because then you have the spanning facilities at a state and national level. I mean, think about the economy. Connections to, say, Japan. I was going to say China, but let's not get into that feud. Their economy depends more on being connected to the world and then the limitations on the cable. So if the country invested, remember, Global Crossing failed because it was too much capacity. They've got to have scarcity to make money. But if your economy depends on it, you invest in this as a national resource, and it becomes a trivial expense rather than a big expense for a private company, and the economy more than benefits. So let's take a look at one example. We now have AWS, we have Azure, we have Google services. Why are they limited by a third party in the path having to make a profit? That doesn't make sense. And that's why we don't have connected healthcare. So I could take a device like the watch and make it a health monitor. But you need a separate account, or you need to pair it with your phone. It becomes complicated. And then you have to, each device, you negotiate again and again and again. If we had an infrastructure approach, we'd enable that innovation, and at each scale, it would just work.
So in preparing for this, we had a kind of outline, and you're sort of getting to this point about new paradigms require a new point of view and not just incremental change. And then you talk about, of course, you mentioned healthcare, education, enabled cities, smart cities, but I want to touch on this paywall point, which makes failure the default. Could you explain a little bit about what is a paywall in this context, and how does it apply to this services versus infrastructure?
I want to get back to the smart cities things. So let's say I make a device. It could be a heart monitor, it could be a light bulb. Okay, and I plug it, or you go through the airport. It doesn't work. You don't even need a paywall. It's in a grease screen. We have all these legacies of the gated city, which are these walls you got to get past. And we've got now what I call the interweb. It works for the web. It assumes there's a human. Oops, sorry, I dropped this. It assumes there's a human at a keyboard, and that works. But once you get devices, connected healthcare, you're trying to do education, trying to do all this, you've now got secondary stakeholders who don't even know the paywall exists. They can't pay, they can't agree, they can't get past it. That's why we need an open infrastructure approach. Now, for transition, we can keep some of the legacy, SSID, perimeter security, but going ahead, we need to have an open infrastructure, do encryption, and understand how to operate safely in that world.
Okay, so is there more to it though? The free rider point, I mean, I guess just to repeat, you're saying a sidewalk, and you made this point, and again, the pieces you wrote for Broadband Breakfast, infrastructure, in your view, is not a utility, and why is that the case?
Okay, this is wordsmithing, because one of the problems, you can't go to dictionary and say this is a definition. So try to figure out how people understand the word. So people understand the word utility is something metered, a service, like water is utility, electricity, they're metered, and but where sidewalks are infrastructure, they just sit there. They're a basic facility you can use. And unfortunately, we still have the metaphor, the way I say it, is that the internet is this precious fluid pumped out of the ground through these little pipes. And every time you put a light bulb, you open up a spigot. That's the wrong metaphor. It's more like the internet's the way we use the available wires at facilities. And, again, we get away with bad metaphors because they seem to work. So as long as we have a human with a keyboard, we can get past this paywall and everything metaphor, but it does not work for the next generation of device. If you look behind me, you can see I'm experimenting with all sorts of devices. And there's a long history. There's part of the old Sage computer there from the 1950s.
Well, I think you said you have 220 Wi-Fi devices in your home.
On last cap, but yes. And
so do you run into capacity issues? No. Do you run into connection issues?
No. Now, I'm using Ubiquiti, which is semi-professional gear, but it's relatively simple. It's not that expensive. It's 130 for each access point, which is not that absurd these days. But this is all, but I'm looking at how do you make that simple? How do you make it available to consumers? But it's a proof of concept that there's not a scaling issue. This stuff works. I've got multiple access points, and I see how I can do it better. So I look at the current protocols and approaches, and it's like with home networking. I said, okay, yes. If you remember in 1995, you had static IP addresses. You had to carefully assign everything. So I designed a protocol, but then put it on time because DHCP happened. It'll auto configure. So I try to, I'm a software guy. You can program around. We can put the smarts in the devices to make it simple. So we can actually make it, much simpler to operate and smoother.
Mm-hmm. So another issue that you've written about, kind of a follow-on to your original piece, was about net neutrality. And you kind of took a bit of a contrarian view from a lot of advocates for net neutrality. You basically said it's a part of the telecom world itself. And so, your piece, of course, was from net neutrality to seizing opportunities for new networks. Could you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah,
what do you think of net neutrality, and why is or isn't it an issue in this world that we're talking about?
Okay, with railroads, you have to have common carriage because they would sell you rides. You had to make sure they were fair, they didn't cheat people or whatever. Roads, you don't have common carriage because roads just are pavement. It doesn't make sense to even talk about common carriage there. So in order to have net neutrality, you have to have the ability to be non-neutral. And a lot of sort of internet advocates say, okay, net neutrality, but class of service and everything need to be differently. But that's the old model. Once a packet's on the network, you don't know it's voice or anything. The powerful idea of voice over IP shows you don't want your network provider doing you favors and trying to make it work for you. So all the presumptions of the favors that have to be neutral go away. So basically, the best ethic packets are inherently neutral because you have no way of knowing what the purpose is or whose they are. So I want to go for inherent neutrality, like on sidewalks, on pavement, and packets, rather than keeping the artifacts of the old system, which is a hyper-complex system. This is why I use the term the regulatorium, because it's useful to think about why does the FCC exist.
And could you just explain that term, regulatorium?
Okay, so in 1927, there was the Federal Radio Commission. So there are multiple origins for the FCC. And we came with spectrum allocation was a terrible idea because it was based on tuning forks. rather than packets. With packets, we can share all the wireless as a common medium. But there's a good book to read, which is Railroad by Richard White, about the history of the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC was created because railroads in the West had high capital costs, no differentiation. So they actually wanted to be regulated in order to have an orderly market. That was the Interstate Commerce Commission. The FCC would have modeled on it because the 1930s telephone system had high costs and no differentiation. Phone calls are phone calls. So it was not viable to have competing phone companies, same reason you have not competing electric grids. But you wanted to prevent misbehavior because it was still the railroad service model. So you created the Federal Communication Commission to ensure a viable industry and to delegate AT&T as the primary steward of the vital need to communicate, because we didn't have the concept of packets back then. Now we don't need that, because by having the city as your customer, we have a market that's in balance, people investing in their own self-interest. And the legacy of the FCC is that if we depend on service providers, cable TV companies, the worst enemy, existential threat, is Netflix, the customers who can do it themselves. And this is, again, we bring us back.
Right. Right. So we have another question. I'll let you try again here. Mike Wendy has raised the question of innovation, and he's using the analogy of the Chicago L being usurped by private cars. Okay, so is what's right and what's wrong in your view, Bob, about that?
Basically, we have to be careful about our analogies, because there's still use for trains for more efficient energy and stuff in the form of transport. But it basically, in this case, if you want to run a private wire and compete, you're welcome to. But this is a real market. In other words, we don't have all the physical artifacts, all the complexities. The raw packets are really sort of this pure ideal market, because there's no other information there than the infrastructure. So the innovation would proceed apace, because you've got thousands and thousands of cities, you've got millions of homes and everything. Each one lays technology. Look at the Moore's Law in your house. It went from $200 modems at 2,400 bits to gigabit switches at $5 a port or less. So we've seen innovation go pace. The interesting case of innovation was modems. It took many years to get to 56K, and they stopped. And the reason they stopped, it had nothing to do with Moore's Law. It was the phone company controlled the other end, and that 56 was reverse subbing the codec. It had nothing to do. Once you're on the wire, we could run gigabits. Copper's limited. USB wire, 20 gigabits, is copper.
All right.
So it's really about innovation, enabling it.
So let's kind of, we've got about 8 minutes left here, Bob, and we've covered a lot of ground. I'd love to kind of cover more thoughts that you have too, but I want to just hone in on, practically speaking, whether we're greenfield or brownfield, like whether it's from fresh or it's transitioned. Let's talk about how this works concretely, right? So how is it politically going to be saleable to do a dramatic transition like you're suggesting? And secondly, how is it going to work concretely? So the city's going to make some end of the hookup, and who else is going to be it? Not everyone's going to be a Bob Frankston, on the back end. So we're going to need some intermediaries in here. So talk through how it's going to work concretely.
Okay, first, transition. The nice thing is the two models can coexist. You own your home network, but you buy passage from an existing telecom provider. The broadband pipe that they saw was the way to make money selling your services has become just a straight tunnel through telecom to the other services. So any city that does this doesn't have to, you don't have to change everything at once. You can change it just like campuses buy connections. Individual cities can buy it, they can buy passage. As cities are adjacent, interconnect, they can connect directly. Now remember, everybody runs their home network. They're not me. But I took my understanding, and I actually did write the software. I took a lot of change economics. I got existing network translation. I got the drivers, put Windows and all this. So I made it possible that anybody can do it without an installer. So a city would hire people to do it. At the same time, would make it simpler to manage and maintain. Remember, all those people running at networks now are not going to disappear. They're going to be looking for jobs, and you can hire them to do the city. In the same way, you buy a pipe from your house to the rest of the world, you can still get your long distance connection from another carrier. And the thing is, if you buy a gigabit business pipe, now when you have your residential gigabit, you're sharing with maybe 1,000 other people. Everybody thinks they've got a gigabit, but they don't. That's why it's only $5 a month more than 150 megabits.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get a business thing which has the guaranteed capacity, that turns out to be not that much more than the consumer, and is very shareable. So the price the city gets for the fat pipe is very small. And when they directly interconnect, there's no charge.
And who's going to be offering? Again, I kind of come back to the three-tiered model I've been talking about: infrastructure and services, but operation of the network.
Well,
is that in your view kind of the city or the contractor of the city that buys the city?
Well, who operates the sewers? Sometimes the city, sometimes they hire people. It's just a job function. In other words, the city's responsible for making it happen. And people say cities can't do this. Sewers and water are a lot more complicated than networking. The roads are more complicated, and they do a great job, or maybe in some cases at least an adequate job.
Yeah,
the water is not brown sludge.
Here's another question from Mike about core innovation, right? And so again, let's come back one last time to this.
What does that mean?
Well, I think the notion would be innovation in the ability to transmit bits.
That's we haven't even started to innovate. I remember years ago somebody commented to me, "I can light up a fiber for a terabit, but nobody wants to buy it." Right now we're locked into the old model, telcos and innovation. Once we get rid of that, and you've got a vibrant market where all you have to do is compete on who can do the best job of getting packets to Mosey along, you're going to get a lot more innovation. You're not tied into a single thing. Sure. Well, the other thing you learn, if you install Windows on a 20-year-old machine, it still works. Well, 10-year-old, it still works. Okay.
Yeah.
In the same way, once you normalize the IP, if I've got an escape hatch with Wi-Fi, I expect once spectrum is no longer valuable because wireless is mainly going to be to the nearest, fiber connection.
Yeah.
The resistance to ultra wideband will go away. We're going to see a lot more innovation. And you look at Wi-Fi 6 and everything, and I'm saying Wi-Fi 6, not 5G, the same radio, but it shows you that we haven't even begun. And this is the thing. Everybody thinks it could be good. We haven't started to innovate.
Right. Well, we got another question here. Let's go ahead and take this as our last question. You can segue off this to other points you'd like to make. Sorry, it's kind of taken up a lot of space here.
No, I'll say that. It's actually the opposite. Netflix.
Repeat the question for people because it's a little bit.
People say media is the drive. I don't remember the full thing, but media is a driver of network capacity.
Okay.
And that was true in the days of the cable. But today it's opportunistic. We have YouTube because we happen to have a system tuned for delivering video. We have Netflix because there's so much capacity. Once we switched to the packet model, that it became easy to do. We have Akamai that cache it. You don't have to send all the bits from one source. That's an example of innovation. We're not innovation simply in a faster network. We're innovation in the way we think. So instead of a cable head end, we got a fan out locally. And I wrote that by purpose versus discovery. Then we discovered new things we can do with it. If it's not good for video, we'd have, we now have HTML5, you run things locally. We could have had the same interactive commerce 25 years ago by sending the programs down instead of running on websites. So innovation is basically, it's the reverse. It's not that the innovation destroys capacity. Capacity creates the opportunity for innovation, and then it iterates. People say, oh, that's great, we want more. So the key example is the web created the capacity that made voice over IP work. We didn't create capacity of voice over IP. Once the capacity was there, it magically started to work, and that's what confuses people. It breaks the cause and effect. It's a very different dynamic.
Well, those are great words to kind of close us out. But do you have anything else you'd like to add about some of the things that readers and watchers of Broadband Breakfast Live Online every Wednesday at noon should be aware about or thinking about in terms of helping to think through what you view as the future paradigm where infrastructure and services are different in their goal and capacity?
I mean, in a minute, it's very short, but basically you need to think about the best ideas are discovered. So we need to create basically an opportunity for discovery. And by removing the paywalls, having open connectivity, we create the opportunity for the kind of discovery that gave us the web. And we haven't even started to look at the interconnected physical world. So all the policies right now are optimized for services, for 5G services and things. We need one optimized for discovery and innovation for what we can't imagine.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you, Bob Frankston, being with us, being our first guest in the new series on Champions of Broadband. Next week, Wednesday, the 29th, we'll be joined by Jim Baller. Continuing the conversation, we'll have many guests, many different points of view. If you have someone to suggest that would be a good candidate, please feel free to email me, drew@breakfast.media. Thank you for joining. See you next Wednesday at 12 noon.